And we are live. Hello, hello. Welcome to Deploy Friday. I'm Chad Carlson from the Developer Relations team at Platform.sh, and welcome back to another episode where we're talking about everything interesting in web development, in testing, in continuous deployment, and continuous integration. And today we're going to be focusing on the concepts of progressive delivery and specifically around feature flags. And I'm really excited today to have two guests with me who are going to help me talk about that. So first we got Dave Caro, who is a continuous delivery evangelist from Split.io. How you doing, Dave?
Awesome, thank you.
No problem. Good to see you. And we also have Ben Nadel, co-founder of InVision app. Sorry, I couldn't read my own handwriting. How are you, Ben?
No problem. Very good. Excited to be here.
Oh, me too. Me too. Well, thank you guys again for coming. I think always with these conversations, we got feature flags right at the top of the byline, but there are going to be plenty of people who haven't heard of it before, think they know what it is, but don't. Maybe we could start there and focus on what your relationships with feature flags are, how you understand them, and maybe how you use them at your company. I don't know, Dave, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I'll do sort of a little story about what I ran into in the wild talking about that. And then Ben, if you can kind of bring it to the ground with like the day-to-day, like as a developer, like what's this doing, right?
But yep, that'd be great.
So feature flags, sometimes people get tripped by the word flag. And you'll ask people, do you use feature flags? And they might say, oh yeah, well, when I compile, I have a flag that changes how my code ends up. Or when I launch a server, I can give it flags that dictate which code's going to run on the server. Feature flags are actually a very cool innovation that happens all the way down at the individual user and session level. So rather than something I do when I'm compiling or something I do when I'm launching a server, literally as tens or hundreds or millions of people are flowing through your code, you can actually make a decision on the fly for each user which code experience they should get. Essentially, it's a gate sitting in front of a block of code, and maybe you're sending somebody one of several ways, or you're just saying, hey, I will expose this piece or not based on whether it's true for this user, right? So why that's important and why that's different than a compile time thing or a launch time thing is that you push code all the way to production that can be off for most people, except maybe your developers and your testers. And then you can gradually expose it to different cohorts of users based on rules. It doesn't have to be, keeping track of every user. It could be, hey, is this a free user versus a premium? Is this a person who's been with us for more than 90 days, whatever. So feature flags, really simple way to look at it. It's a function call to a subsystem that returns which way should I send this user or this backend process at this very moment in time, right? And it can be changed on the fly in production without pushing new code, without a config change, without routing changes, et cetera, right? So hopefully that kind of helps.
Yeah, it's I think because it's such a simple concept, this idea that code is deployed but not necessarily activated, it's sometimes hard for someone to wrap their mind around what is actually impactful about that, because it's so deceptively simple yet so radically different than how people have been developing software for the last 2 decades. And sometimes I find that the easiest way to demonstrate the power of it is with a very simple concrete example, which for me happens to revolve oftentimes around refactoring some database queries. I might have a database query that's running slow and I want to refactor it and deploy that into production. But messing with your database access can be problematic, especially if it changes traffic patterns or changes, the way your database hits indexes. So to be able to deploy code and then just slowly and incrementally move certain users to access the database using a different query, and then let the vast majority of users continue to use the known quantity, the old database access layers, and then be able to watch the performance of that database as you're slowly moving users into that new access pattern. And not just to be able to slowly move people onto that pattern, but the power of the feature flag is not just that you can turn it on, it's that you can turn it off. So if you start funneling new users into a new data access pattern and the CPU on your database starts to go up, or there's some sort of network latency issues, you can turn it off. And suddenly you've prevented what would historically have been likely a database outage or a complete site outage now that you had a problematic query, and you can just turn it off and you go back to the way it was. no harm, no foul. You can now reevaluate what happened, what went wrong. So it's almost like you don't get it until you see it work for the first time, and then you realize just how powerful it is and how it actually can change how you approach every aspect of development. Because that's just, a database query is like such a small piece of it. But once you not only understand that you can turn it on and then turn it off if there's a problem, I mean, that's huge. That's a real game changer.
Yeah, probably a big part of being able to do the convincing of getting people to start implementing in the first place. I don't know what it was like at InVision, but that's huge right there. What's rollback like on any particular workflow that we're having in development? I'm sorry, I cut you off, Dave.
No. I was going to say that's you're spot on, Ben. Like to help people understand this, one of the common ways to explain it was just to have a big red button. Wouldn't you love to have a kill switch instead of a war room with a attempt to work a revert plan, a rollback plan, and rollback plans, if they're really well thought out, you're like, oh, well, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do this other thing. And then the DBA chimes in and says, the indexing is going to take a little longer than we thought. So could be a few hours. I think we ought to be back to full performance by morning. People in the war room are like, oh my God. Right. And like Ben's saying with I think just a little bit, we're going to talk about progressive delivery. Right. And the idea there is like, instead of a big bang, instead of a cutover and a prayer, you basically can slowly bring population into the new experience and watch what's happening, right? And like if you're bringing in 2, 3, 5%, you'll know at some point you know that things are not the same in a bad way, and you can say, okay, well, let's back off and let's figure that out, right? And so it just changes from the sort of the stress level. I see it as a quality of life thing, which is if you're in a very risk-averse place, then you're going to test the daylights out of something and plan the daylights out of something, and it takes forever to get every little change anywhere, even if it's just a little change, right? But if you have a situation where you can push something out behind a flag and nobody's seeing it except your own team to make sure that in production it behaves as you expected, like you can do that all day long. You can do that many times a day. You don't have to plan for the twice a month, all hands on deck, fire drill, right? And so it totally changes things, absolutely. And I think so. Ben, would you say quality of life is up there on the list of things in terms of or stress level or right? What do you think?
Oh, 1,000%. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to deploy something and I have the thought, what's the worst that could happen? Like the worst that could happen is I get up, it doesn't perform the way I expected it to, or maybe there's a bug because there's some edge case that starts to come through in the logs that I didn't anticipate. And I just turn it off. And yeah, maybe a handful of people saw an issue, but it wasn't an outage. It wasn't a widespread problem. And, statistically speaking, it's probably no different than some random network blip between the user and the server. So it gives me this is a very controversial statement, but feature flags give me, I think, more confidence and more peace of mind than automated testing. Because the way I look at automated testing is I test the things I anticipate breaking. But what feature flags allow me to do is react to the things that I didn't anticipate. And tests just can't do that because they're a compile time or a pre-deployment process.
Mm-hmm. As far as you can predict in the first place. But now you have, so maybe that gets into something I've written down for us here is, what's the problem that they solve? I think they give you that kind of confidence because they provide you with the toolkit to have rollback be a part of how you approach the introduction of any new feature. Maybe another thing that I'm picking up here from you, Dave, is enabling experimentation in the way that you do block off these pieces of code and introduce new features, that experimentation becomes a part of any new release. And I don't know if you maybe speak to that and say how that relates to what you do at Split or what Split does.
Yeah. So by the way, we should be careful about using a term like rollback, right? Because when you think about rollback, right? The beauty, like Ben said, is that you just turn it off. You didn't have to push a new image somewhere. You didn't have to kill containers and launch new containers. You didn't have to change routing. It's not Istio. You're like, literally, it's just, okay, dude, I'm just going to turn it off. And literally, we have people that joke with us, this was so cool. I did this from the stands at a game, or I was on my couch. I got home, I was on the couch at home, and I realized that I didn't like the response time. It wasn't horribly broken, but I noticed that it was a bit slower than the regular experience. And so rather than like stop what I'm doing and go back to the office or go into my office, you can den and like get 10 people on a call, we just turn it off, and tomorrow we'll look again, right? And so rollback is not, oh, do we have the images ready? Are their servers ready? Or how do we get the code? And what about this? And and what do I do with the traffic? It's literally just because you're switching it where it is. The code is in production, and you're just changing which code the users or the sessions pass through on the fly. But Chad, you asked about experimentation, and I think that what's interesting is that the concepts of experimentation, the sort of people think about experimentation, they might think, oh, this very disciplined sort of double-blind study, statistical significance, like very, very disciplined thing. But there's really a spectrum, and experimentation can actually be super helpful just in the case Ben is giving, which is, hey, I've tested a lot of stuff, but there's edge cases I probably didn't know about, or there's things that I just couldn't find in my automated testing. But now that I'm in production and people are flowing through it, I'm starting to see some things. And by using the same techniques, so I should just baseline, how does experimentation work? And Chad, you're wearing headphones. When I flew on the plane, I wore my noise canceling Bose headphones, right? And you guys know how those work, right? How does a noise canceling headphone, how does it do its magic? Anybody want to take a shot at that? How does it make the sound of the plane go away?
Not sure.
So it's actually got microphones on the outside.
Yeah, it produces some kind of, right.
And it's introducing an inverse of the sound wave along with your podcast or your music or whatever. And so the outside noises are canceled out and the signal is clearer. It's not overwhelmed by all the noise, right? So with experimentation, if you think about, you've got users and you're sending, let's make it easy, half and half. You're sending half the users down the status quo experience, and you're sending the other half the users down the new experience. The cool thing is that all of the things are equal. If you're running a marketing campaign, or there's weird weather, or there's latency on the network in general, or whatever, both of those cohorts get all that outside stuff the same, right? The people that are going through the status quo code and the new code, because you've split them randomly, and you're not being biased about how you choose them, you literally are. So when you look at the metrics and compare the metrics between the two populations, all of the it wasn't my change stuff gets canceled out, and your change shows up super bright and vivid because you've actually, that's the magic of experimentation, right? Is that you're looking for statistical differences, and if you've split the population right, if you're disciplined about how you split it, then only thing that should be different between the old code and the new code is the changes you made, not that somebody's running an advertising campaign that's driving more people to your site or whatever, right? So what this unlocks is not just, oh, I'm running an A/B test and I'm going to run it for a while and I'm going to decide which experience is better, but literally, hey, wow, we pushed that thing about 15 minutes ago, and it seems, look at that. I was trying to get people to do more of this, but I didn't realize that my new code does this other thing that I wasn't aware of, but that gets bubbled up for you. So the example I'll often use, which is super simple, the dev team is trying to create more tasks. They want users to create more tasks in their system, right? And they, sure enough, are able to get like 10 or 11, 12% more tasks. And you're like, ooh, we're heroes, right? But what if that same population is 25% slower? The latency, right? And if 50 milliseconds is enough to have people like bail on your product, then a 25% bump in performance, slower is not good, right? And so you're like, hey, we're heroes, but you know what? Before we go to the beach and party about it, maybe we ought to go back and see if we can optimize and figure out why we're slower. And and then roll it out, right? And the example I'm giving is what's called a.
Hey, Dave, you might want to turn off your video. You're cutting out quite a bit.
Yeah, just in the last like 3 minutes.
Are we losing for good?
Maybe. Oh.
Come back to us, Dave.
Metric, which is, it's something that you're watching all the time in an automated way.
Dave, can you hear us?
You didn't expect it to change, but when it changed, you were pretty stoked the system let you know, instead of you having to be hyper vigilant and look everywhere and check the logs and check this and check that. You know, I used to be in load testing. I'm not seeing you guys.
Oh, we lost him. Sorry, everyone. We got quite a bit of choppiness there on his audio for a bit. We're going to try and recover from that, though, and hopefully get Dave back. Okay. We're talking about giving developers the ability to have a kill switch when they release something new, and then also being able to provide the kind of structure for running, say, a 50-50 split on the release of a new feature to get real feedback on whether or not that's working, or if we have unexpected changes that aren't a part of our testing. For example, when we released in the first place, they could give us a really good idea about what this feature is really changing about our application. I mean, Ben, do you have any stories about how, I think I probably tried to touch on before, what it was like convincing other people in your company to take this approach to development, and what the big highlights were for, you know, showing them it could very well be this kind of experiment and kill switch. But any big success stories that really come to mind about implementing feature flags with your work?
I mean, we've been using feature flags on a daily basis for, you know, coming on 6 years now. So as far as success stories, I mean, I can't imagine developing products without feature flags at this point. As far as experimentation, and Dave, you look like you're coming in much clearer now, by the way. As far as experimentation goes, we don't use feature flags so much for experimentation. A lot of our feature validation tends to happen pre-development in our workflow. A lot of user interviews and screen sharing with prototypes, things of that nature. So by the time we get to development, like when it comes, by the time it's been handed down from product managers to engineering managers to engineers, we're basically on the right path, you know, right in quotes, because we think we're doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. For us, feature flag is more about safety in terms of the separation, again, of the deployment from the release. But then it also, for us, the probably the understated win for us is just how it changes the way you actually build and review and release a feature. So, you know, pre-feature flags, if you had to do a large chunk of work, I don't think it would be uncommon for an engineer or a set of engineers to build something over the course of weeks, then provide a pull request that maybe touches, you know, 67 files, and then requires a QA environment to spin up with a database that has the right amount of data in it so that you can test the right, you know, the latency and maybe run load tests on it. And the whole thing is just this massive endeavor. And with feature flags, you essentially cut out a huge swath of the problem that is associated with the old type of product workflow. If I have to take that same, you know, multi-week, multi-month development project and work on it with feature flags, I'm deploying code to production every day. The pull requests are being shared with engineers. You know, maybe they're a handful of files. They're very focused on a particular part of a larger feature, so they're a lot easier to understand. They're being deployed to production, but because they're behind a feature flag, we don't have to worry about users hitting them, but we can turn features on for quality assurance teams, for our internal engineers, for our customer support teams. They can start to review it in production as it's being built on top of a production database with production traffic affecting all of the access patterns. And you start to just, everything about developing features becomes easier when you can incrementally move the line forward without having to worry about a massive big bang release of all the code that you've been writing and then just hoping it works when it hits production. So it's, and like, you just repeat that every day. And once you start doing it that way, you can't develop features any other way. It doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, I would say that's a spot on point. There's a graphic that one of my friends did, which shows continuous delivery really only works if you have very small changes coming along on a regular basis. And it's easy. It's just intuitive. It's easier to inspect small scope things quickly and move them forward than it is to have like this massive ball of code that, you know, the old days we had these, you know, we had release week at the company I worked at, and the release engineer spent 3 days just trying to merge files. Like, this is sort of pre-Jenkins even. I mean, like, right? It's just like everybody get their files, and then this release manager was the wizard that would somehow get all the stuff together and figure out what's broken and coordinate with people to fix it before they try to even build it. Like, and now with continuous delivery, and you don't have to be like continuous deployment every, you know, we're hitting code every 30 seconds into prod, but literally you're moving smaller bits. And Ben, one thing maybe for people who, you know, one of the challenges when it's new to you is how do I do my work in smaller pieces? Like, is there something I can push? And, you know, because before feature flags, the issue was, how can I create something that's whole enough that it can go all the way to the user? Even though I have this 3 weeks of work I'm planning, but can I first push just a part of the feature, and then can I push a little more? And that's even trickier, which is that you were pushing it all the way to the user live, which is different than I'm scaffolding it up in prod just for my developers, really, until I'm really ready to go. And there's a notion of a keystone feature or a keystone flag, which is I don't actually expose it to the user until I'm really, really done.
Exactly.
Right. And so instead of this, again, we want to get away from the fire drill. We want to get away from, like, you know, when you're in your 20s, the excitement of maybe it's all going to blow up is kind of fun. Right. But actually, you know, burning people out is not really a great business model. Right. And so what if we can make it sustainable that you can actually be pushing code way more often? And it's so much more gratifying to actually make a change and have it in prod, like in minutes or maybe a day at worst, as opposed to like, oh, well, there's a window 2 weeks from now where maybe we're going to go live, but if something else goes wrong, we'll have to wait another 2 weeks. Right. So It's just a very different way of, people think, oh, like some people who haven't heard of continuous delivery are thinking, wait, push code every day or every hour? That sounds so stressful. So talk about that, Ben. Talk about how stressful that is versus the old way.
It's significantly less stressful because it's so focused and it's so small. So earlier in the call, you talked about experimentation and use task management as an example, and how do we get more people to create tasks or to complete tasks. If we can continue to riff on the idea of task management, imagine that you're introducing task management as a concept to your application, and literally the first deploy I might make is a button in the UI that says task management, and it's hidden for everybody. And that's it. It doesn't call anything. Maybe it routes to a view that doesn't even exist yet. But like, I just want to get that button in place so that I know it looks good on a UI, but no one else but me is going to see it. And then after that's been deployed, maybe I create a database migration that creates some sort of task persistence. And all I'm doing is now creating the view that reads from that table and then has an empty state that says you have no task. Like, I don't even care about adding tasks yet. I just want to get to the point where I can now route from that button to that view to list tasks, and I deploy that. And so every time I make these tiny incremental changes, you wouldn't necessarily look at it and say the thing that I'm deploying is making this whole thing feature complete. But what I'm deploying is a incremental step on the way to a complete feature that is in some way holistic in and of itself, that it accomplishes one thing, whether that one thing is getting me to this view, whether that one thing is How do I add a task for the first time? That's a workflow that has some client side and some server side components to it. And you start to be able to, one, pull in people to review code that are more likely to understand the thing that you're talking about. Maybe part of the code is very front end framework based and you want to have a JavaScript person review that, or maybe now you're dealing with database queries and now you want to have a database oriented person review that. And every PR brings with it just more confidence because you have a smaller amount of code to review. You always know that code is behind a feature flag. And I don't know. I'm losing my own train of thought here.
But no, you hit it, which is you've got a lot of successes.
Yeah.
Right. And another term you hear kind of tossed around in some circles is sort of psychic load, or how much brain does it take? And reviewing 800 lines of code is a lot harder than 32 lines of code or whatever, right?
Absolutely.
And if you can build in blocks, each one which is pretty easy to grok, and sort of check it off. Okay, that button is there. It does have the call. Oh, I built the thing that button calls. There's nothing it does yet. It's sort of a stub, but it can call the thing, right? Yep. And then I've got my data structures in place. Well, you're building it up a bit at a time, and whether you expose it to the user or not, you're actually able to prove it. The other joke is like, well, it works on my laptop. Yeah. Right? So what's cool about feature flags is I don't care whether it works or great, but does it work in prod? And it's not, I can't push it to prod. It's not done. Yes, you can push it to prod as long as you don't expose it to anybody but yourself or your team or whatever, right? So that's that paradigm shift. You don't get fired for testing in production if no users are being exposed to the thing you're testing in production. In fact, it's way more sane than having your laptop or a staging. There's people that still have 15 different levels of environments. They have the dev environment. Yeah. They've got the int1 and dev 2 and the performance testing environment, like all these environments. And aside from it being like a horrible waste of resources, it's also really hard to keep them in sync, and they're never really in sync, right? So it's just a way of, ironically, it's simpler. And when you're smaller pieces is simpler. Like you could be on not enough sleep and probably review a small code change. But if you're trying to review 16 modules that are all interrelated and jump in and out of each other, you better have some really good sleep and maybe, 3 friends that are over your shoulder while you're doing it. Right. So it's just yeah.
Well, and another thing that's great about it is, if you can build and deploy a feature incrementally, you actually unblock a lot of other people that you might not be considering during the primary feature development. When you take a feature from pure concept to production, it moves through a lot of steps, and each one of those steps adds a certain degree of fidelity, right? You have an idea for something, and then you put it on paper, and it starts to look different as you write it down. It starts to take on a different format. And then maybe you take that and you start to mock it out into a prototype. And now you're getting a different sense of how it works. And then maybe you start to make it interactive. And again, you're adding on this layer of fidelity, and it's changing the way that you think about the feature as it begins to materialize. Well, going from a prototype to production is another step in terms of adding fidelity. So you might have product people who have been thinking about how something works. You might be working with designers who have a very strong idea of how something should look and behave. But most of the time, when that code finally hits production and people actually start using it, and they're using real data, and they're seeing real latency, and they're seeing real interactions, it's going to have an impact on the way they think about the feature. Now, if you've developed an entire feature before you deploy it to production, before your QA people get to it, before your product people can interact with it, now they're like, oh, this is totally not what we expected, or yeah, we didn't anticipate, this, that, or the other thing. But if you can release a quarter of a feature to production and expose it to your QA people, to your product people, not only can QA start getting to work right away on making sure all of their smoke tests and whatever kinds of stuff the QA people do, like they can start to do that, but now your product people can start to interact with it, and they don't have to wait for you to complete development before they can get a sense of how something is working in production, and how they might need to now create a feedback loop between how the product is actually being developed and how it's behaving in production. So you not only are you getting the emotional satisfaction of moving those tickets across the Jira board because you're completing tasks and deploying smaller things. You're also now enabling peripheral people to the product development lifecycle, the QA people, the product people, the support people, that they can start getting involved in that game a lot earlier.
Sure. Okay. I'm really trying to see how this fits in, because I don't know, how familiar are you guys with Platform SH?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit, Dave? That's
just
all right.
Conceptual. Just conceptual.
No, I just want to know, because this is what you just said, Dave, and how, okay, we want to really test these things on production. That's what matters. And we don't want to create any workflow blockers between teams in collaborating on the release of a new feature, so that if we can release it in increments, people get the satisfaction of contributing and seeing those things completed. We're going to have them near production data. We don't have to deal with the orchestration of all of these staging environments to set aside places where the full feature has to be developed. Okay. On platform, sort of the approach is we're going to tie everything to the branch. Every branch inherits data from production that can be resynced at any time. And we still use that as a model to encourage this kind of incremental development model that you say, okay, we're going to do a small PR. You should still do that. But if you choose to do the big feature buildup, you can feel confident at any time that you're going to have real production data. You're not going to have traffic, but you're going to have real production data. And you're going to be able to roll back through reverts. That is pretty fine, because we preserve both of the build slugs from the previous production image and our in development feature. So what's the sell that I have to give to somebody on my team that's used to working that way, of how they should start thinking about introducing these catches, these toggles into each new feature that they release, if they do have this kind of tool set at their disposal? Does it clash in your mind at all? Does it still see a space for it?
What do you think, Ben?
I mean, I think branch-based development, I mean, so the closest thing that I can relate to that in terms of things I have hands-on experiences with is with Netlify. If I have a branch in GitHub, Netlify will create, I believe, a feature branch, or like a subdomain that pertains just to that feature. A subdomain that's just for that branch-based deployment, which is great, because now I can give that URL to somebody, and it's not a quote unquote production URL, but it is production like, and it has all the new code. And then I can either push that through to true production, or we can continue to iterate. And so there is still that sense that you get the protection of having something that's pre-production but production like. But what you miss, the gap between that solution and the feature flag based approach, is that once you go to production, it's still an all or nothing, right? Because you still have a feature environment, but that feature environment is still for everyone who hits that environment. Mm-hmm. So when you hit the button to go to production, everyone's seeing that. So the feature flags bring that lower level granularity, where even when you're going to production, you can still now have a narrower scope of exposure for the thing that you actually changed.
Right. That's a great point. So Chad, to building what Ben said, so let's say you've got essentially this is a transient environment, right? You're sort of cloning up a transient environment, bringing it up, maybe for a few minutes, maybe for a few days, who knows what, right? Mm-hmm. But there's probably multiple payloads in there. It's a feature branch or whatever, but there's multiple pieces of work that are probably in that thing. If you're super lucky to have single piece flow, okay, maybe not. But realistically, you're still, like Ben said, you've got this all or nothing push that you're going to do when you decide, hey, I think that's looking good. I'm going to put that in real prod. What's cool is, let's say you've got just 5 things in there, but many people would have, I don't have fingers and toes for how many different things would be in a push, right? So, but you got 5 in there, and when you hit production for real, you're like, ooh, this one right here is not so good, right? Historically, we'd say, oh, shoot, we got to go back to the previous image, the previous release. So we'll revert back to the previous release. And if you got good tools, that could be quick or relatively intellectually easy, whatever, right? But how much cooler is it that you just take that one and you go, okay, you're going back, and the other 4 live on. So the teams that built the other 4 bits of code that aren't problematic can check the box, be done, and move on to the next thing, not be like, The other team's thing is why we're not, you can't go see it in prod because we got reverted out an hour ago because this other thing in the push was problematic, right?
Mhm.
So again, a quality of life thing and actually a teaming thing, which is that you don't want to be the team that had the bug, and you don't want to be the other 4 teams either, and you don't want to be any of those 5 people in the break room, like right, you know, it's right. So what if? How cool would it be? Oh yeah, hey, sorry, I hear your thing had to get turned off. Yeah, but we're good. We're going to our offsite at the pool hall back when people did that thing, but like, you know, like right, like so that again, it's not one or the other, it's both, Chad. So let's say people are using platform.sh, they're doing this sort of branch-based test environment or whatever, and they decide to promote it or whatever. To have the granularity of having each of the significant changes gated, right? Just gives you the ability to be granular about tweaking it on the fly in production in minutes. And then maybe you're going to iterate the whole shebang again and run an integration test or whatever. But in the meantime, you know, the 4 features that are okay live on, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's not suspender, it's not belt and suspenders. They're different things.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
good.
And I, you know, as we've been talking about feature flags, I think we've been focusing very heavily on this idea that there is a transient state that is the not everyone is seeing this, but eventually everyone will see this, and the feature flag no longer makes a difference. And you're basically where platform SH is, where it was not production and now it's production. But there is a swath of feature flags that are more operational than they are transient, where I might have something that only exists for a certain number of customers, and that will always be true. And that's not a feature flag that I'm ever taking out of the application. Maybe it's, you know, a custom feature that they paid for, or maybe it's adds some complexity that only they're willing to incur, so on and so forth. But it's not a feature flag that's ever coming out of the application, and it will forever be in there, and it will forever only be turned on for a subset of customers. And you can't get that from a branch-based deployment, because again, once a branch goes to production, it's on for everybody.
Yeah, all or nothing, right? Yeah, and you mentioned operations. So there's a term ops toggle that actually can also be used. You may have a feature that you're willing to turn off when you need to shed load.
Yep.
So let's say you've got a recommendation engine that's, you know, it's nice, but it's not core to the user experience. And when you hit a peak day, that sucker gets a little bit hot. And so you would, so this is a long-lived feature flag as well, which is like, hey, okay, we need to defeature this or defeature that, and we're doing that based on the current load, and we want to be able to do that without any major fireworks. We literally can just, I mean, if you're a real thrill seeker, you could automate that thing, but you're probably going to have an alert when somebody decides, yeah, we should throw the switch, right? You know, right? So, hey, by the way, I wanted to just, when I vanished off into the Bitbucket there at the beginning, the story I was trying to make was that, yeah, there's experimentation and there's like really disciplined A/B testing, but that same magical statistical engine is actually what lets you do that guardrail monitoring thing, where you basically have, you know, we call them organizational metrics. They're just something that you as a team decide you always care about: latency, errors, maybe unsubscribes, maybe order flow, whatever it is, right? And you're just you want to watch that all the time. And instead of having people that go check all those things each time you push code, you can actually be watching for changes in those things, good or bad, all the time. And it's kind of like, you know, exception-based notifications. Instead of being notified, everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine, you basically want to get an alert when something's not fine, right? And if you, like you're saying, Ben, from testing, if you know what to check, that's great. But
right.
But wouldn't it be nice if you always are watching, I don't know, half a dozen, 2 dozen, you know, not thousands of things, but, you know, there's some key business indicators you keep an eye on, right? And you watch those, you let the system watch it for you. And the thing with feature flags is, because if you're sending some of the people through one experience and some through another, it's very easy if that same thing is keeping track of their experience, because then you can say, hey, does the experience differ significantly between the people who are in the new thing versus are not? And by the way, that's a reason So one example of a kind of a don't do this at home is Booking.com doesn't do a 2%, 5%. I believe their model is literally 50-50. So they're ready to push something live, and they push it to half the population. But here's where it gets interesting. Their stuff is so tight that if they see a divergence in any of the key metrics, they can shut it off inside of a second. Right? So you're on a page and you get to the page and it's like scrambled. There's something really wrong with this page. And you're like, what? And you hit refresh and it's fine again. Now, again, don't do this. Don't try this at home. Like that, the speed at which they can do that is pretty mind-boggling, right? But the idea is really the same, which is that, like, if I can just be watching for unexpected consequences and then react inside of minutes, not hours and days, not like a war room that goes on for 48 hours, right? But like, if I can just see it, react to it, and it's not something I was looking for. It's something that I'm just always watching. I didn't have somebody go like course of the law. So I like to look at the notion of like experimentation is really it's a continuum. Like it's you as this is, when I get the progressive delivery talks, I'm like, I build a pyramid. I go, hey, would you like the ability to turn stuff on and off without having a big fire drill? Okay, that's the decoupling, right? So check. Everybody's be like, that sounds good. And then you say, hey, would you like to have this automated guardrails watching the stuff so you don't have to be hyper vigilant? Oh, sure. That's good, right? And then as we go up, we go, well, would you like to know the impact of your code? Like, would you like to know whether the thing you did accomplished what you wanted it to accomplish with real users, right? And most people would say yes. And if you're in this sort of trying to cycle more often, you can kind of get on this hamster wheel thing where it's all just about releases. It's vanity metrics around how often are we pushing and how many releases do we get done this month and whatever. And if you're just releasing for the sake of releasing, but you don't know whether it actually helped the business or not, it can be kind of numbing and it's actually kind of a bummer, right? Whereas if you have a meaningful feedback loop, it gives pride of ownership. And even when things go wrong, humans don't really mind when things go wrong if they can figure out how to fix it and fix it. They actually might feel more like a hero having made a mistake and fixed it, and then now it really works well, than if they had just done something and didn't know one way or the other, right? And so that level of the pyramid is being able to easily detect the impact on kind of the business or the user, whatever. And then the very top of the pyramid is traditionally what people think of as A/B testing, which is testing to learn. Like, we don't really know which way the users are going to go on this. Do they want more complexity or not? Like, will they do more? Will they buy more widgets if we give them 6 options instead of 3? Like, we don't know. Will that overwhelm them? And so that's the top of the pyramid. And even at the top, people are like, oh, well, I don't want to build 2 versions of everything. And that's also kind of a myth, which is, no, maybe you've got the status quo and the new thing. That's not 2 versions. That's the thing you think you're going to do anyway. Or dynamic config, which is, hey, I've got a recommendation engine, and I want to try some different variations on do we show the most popular items or the most recommended items, or like what do we show users and how many do we show? And I could create 3 cohorts of users. They're all flowing through the exact same body of code, but the feature flags are carrying those parameters, those config parameters. That's what we call dynamic config. You're sending like a JSON body along with the flag. It's not just on and off. It's like, hey, Ben gets this, Chad gets this, Dave gets that. Right. And then you run that for a few days. We learned a few things. Let's try a different thing. No code change, no code push, no bouncing the servers or pushing new containers. Like, literally, okay, we started a new experiment. We've pushed some different dynamic configs and we're watching how it goes, right? And, and like you're saying, Ben, there might be a long-lived thing. We've got people that do this to show a different banner. During COVID, like, oh, it was great. We could change the banner text to reflect what was going on without having to do a freaking code change or even touch the database, right? So it's kind of a never expanding universe. But like, I think that's useful to kind of look at those other use cases and kind of tie it all together, right?
I like the one you guys mentioned before that, okay, I have a recommendation engine that gets hot. Okay, I can make that a part of my strategy alongside any other experimentation I might have, because Black Friday is going on. Let's go ahead and shut off the experiment that we were doing. And we know ahead of time that this recommendation engine may give us some trouble. So shut that off as well and focus on the task at hand of handling Black Friday traffic. And then once that has gotten past the load that we're expecting or that we didn't expect, whatever the case may be, and we know we've made it through, we can resume what we were doing in the first place and try and get more information about what's going on with our app.
Yeah, this is a term people use. It's called do no harm.
Yeah.
So you know, like the people at Walmart, you know, God bless them, they live in an environment where if they want to make a change, they have to prove that it's actually better than what they had, like, right, and or back to the drawing board, right? And so they have like test to learn and test to launch. And test to launch is, are we detecting any degrading of something that matters to us, right? And and in Microsoft, it was even crazier than that, which is that if they ran an experiment and it came through well, they're like, that's great. Tell you what, as soon as you repeat that experiment with a new cohort of users, we can consider it meaningful, right? So super disciplined, right? Like you know, like because when you know this is Bing, you know, and they're obviously had to catch up with Google, and there's a lot of scale and there's a lot of money in there, but you know, there's a continuum of how you use these concepts, but some of the core things, which is like way less stress, way more control, fine-grained, more knowledge about what's really happening in the real world, as opposed to like debating around a boardroom table. Like there's this notion of HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion, right? And right, who should be making the decision on a deep technical subject? The person who doesn't understand it, right? And the thing is, they want to make the right decision, but if they don't really have the data, they're just going to make a gut decision, right? And instead, you can kind of reverse the flow, which is that you have metric, you have data, you can show them and say, well, we tried this and we tried that, and you know, they're like, whoa, well, geez, that one works better. Let's do that, as opposed to like, no, we're gonna go with, you know, we're gonna go with this idea because I think it's just better. And I don't want to go off. I want to come back to that after we have some more conversation about those stuff on our list here. But like the notion of like a high risk experiment is very different when you actually have a straightforward, repeatable way to answer the question, as opposed to like, let's have a debate and then let's see who has a stronger ego.
Yeah, no, none of the ego come to play. Real data to go with any code change that we make. Keep in control to shut it off if we need to. I'm convinced. Okay, let's tools. Why can't I just throw if else's on everything that I have in my code base? Why shouldn't I do that on every site I have? What's out there tools that would work better?
I'm sorry, can you?
Well, he's basically, this gets back to the like, can't I build this on a weekend?
Yeah, can I build this myself?
So,
I have some sites. Let me do if else's on everything.
So there's a handful of things you see over and over again, which is like, well, I just have a column in my database. I'll use that to determine whether this is on or off for a user. Or I've got, you know, there's various ways people will, you know, Zookeeper. You could, like, if you're talking about servers, like there's various tools that would let you dynamically control how things work without having to push new code. But it turns out, I think, Ben, you and I were talking about this before we went live today, which is that at first you're like, this is pretty straightforward. I don't know why I would need like something. But the reality is, when you're doing it at scale, or when you're doing it all the time, or when you run into various edge cases, you're going to be forever like, oh, I got to do this, I got that. And having a hardened, proven, easily understood, not a black magic, two wizards in the company know how to use it, like something that everybody can get at. Like there's reasons why commercial products exist.
Yep.
You know, scalability, reliability, ease of use, ever expanding features, as opposed to like, well, we built that, but that's not our core business. So we don't have cycles for dealing with this obvious use case that now we have, because, you know, sorry, you can't have resources to enhance your in-house tool, right? So I'd say, so there's a whole, so that's created an industry really of different companies that have some aspect of feature flags as a service that you can just plug in, and they each kind of have their, you know, they each tend to kind of focus on something. You know, one of the smaller players got gobbled up by CloudBees, and they're now part of a suite, right? And so you sort of have a classic suite situation, which is, you know, it's probably okay, but it's not a point, it's not a specialized tool, right? And then each company kind of has a different model. We think, Ben.
I mean, I think when you mentioned core business, like to me, that's the thing, is that I don't know about other engineers. I have too much to do all the time. And when it comes to building a product, building the thing that manages the feature flags is not the thing that makes the company money. It's not the thing that builds the features. every minute that I can spend not worrying about how feature flags work and not worrying about managing some sort of infrastructure and not worrying about synchronizing across, n number of nodes in our deployment situation is time that I can spend building something that the customers actually see and actually get value out of. And it's just, feature flags are not a differentiating feature for my product, so I don't want to build them.
Right. It's I used to say, if you're shipping software, do you want to focus? If you're using a truck analogy, do you want to focus on the truck or the cargo?
Right.
Like your job is to ship goods, not to build a better wheel or redo the differential. Like that's that. Ironically, though, Ben, be honest, for an engineer, right? I could build a better differential. I've got this idea for a limited slip differential that'll blah, 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 right? And it's like, you get your brain wrapped around there. You're like, I'm off, I'm running. I'm having a great time. Right. And
oh yeah, absolutely.
You and I aren't like first time to this rodeo, but it's not just the sort of young bushy eyed people who can get hooked around an idea and like, get it kind of like, I really want to do this thing. Right. And yet you have to remember, like, why am I here?
And it's, the devil is in the details, right? When you think, how can I turn this feature flag on and off? That sounds really super simple, and you could probably build that. But then you're like, well, how do I turn it on for just a subset of users? And you're like, well, okay, maybe that's users targeted by some sort of primary key in your database. And you're like, okay, I could sort of start to think about that. And then you're like, well, what happens if I want to target users where their email address ends in a certain suffix? Or like, well, what happens when I want to do it in certain environments, but not in other environments? And how do I synchronize this across all my data? And how do I start to make these rules different? And maybe it's not true and false anymore. Maybe it's some other type of value where it's, well, maybe I want to set a log setting, like I don't want to have info and trace and other types of logging running all the time, but maybe I want to turn on info level logs occasionally. And that's not necessarily a simple Boolean. And as you start to integrate feature flags into your product development workflow, you start to want to use them in more complicated ways. And you just don't want to have to build that. Like, there are people who have teams focusing on all these use cases and how do we build SDKs that cater to these use cases. And it's just not the thing you want to focus on.
It seems like a really creative space to find out as much as you can about every new feature that you're releasing into your app. What's adoption looking like in the two of your mind? You talk to other people. I mean, you're evangelizing feature flags on your own or within your own company. Like, what does it seem like as far as people buying into the idea and implementing it, buying from services like LaunchDarkly and Split? What is it looking like excitement wise?
I mean, I can talk about, I only have real experience within my own company.
Sure.
We are 100% bought in. I think no one that I know of at the company can imagine building a product without feature flags at this point. When I've talked to people who don't know about feature flags outside of the company, the real hurdle is what we were just talking about, where it seems so simple that someone can't understand why they would need a service for it. And because it seems so simple, and because sometimes you don't really understand the power of it until you see it in practice, it's hard to even understand what the value add is. So there's just a hill you have to get over, I think, before you can really sell people on the idea sometimes.
Mm-hmm. The other issue is, if you're trying to get to continuous delivery, you really can't, or like, for instance, a very specific thing, trunk-based development. Okay. So the good old branch versus, so trunk-based, the idea is that I'm actually going to pretty much commit stuff to the main branch only. I'm not going to have all these separate long-lived branches. I'm going to have short-lived branches in a PR and put it back, but I'm not working on something for 3 weeks on a separate branch, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I'm deploying from master or main, trying to avoid master. If you're doing, people who are doing that don't need a lot of convincing to use feature flags, right? Like, they're like, I couldn't do it. Like, I can't be committing my code to the main branch several times a day, even before it's finished, and have the main branch being deployed several times a day to production if I don't have feature flags. It's just not really an option, right? So for people who already are doing, they've got something going on. Now, people who are trying to move from once a quarter to once a month to every 2 weeks of deployments, like these people are in a different situation, right? And so, but anybody who's trying to go from something that is only once or twice a month to something that approaches more of a once a day, again, they're gonna see this value in decoupling deploy from release, and they're sort of easily convinced. I think it's interesting, Ben, your point, like an engineer who understands this model will be like, oh, I could build that. You know, like
right.
I'll just use database, whatever, right? There's kind of a cluster of things that come along with this, which is the ability to test in production without losing your job. There's sort of a handful of practices that become just so much more practical working in small pieces, shipping stuff all the way to production even before it's ready. You know, like that, right? So, but what I see in the world is that I joined Split 2.5 years ago, and when I first joined, feature flags were just kind of crossing the chasm to the point where there were enough people that it was actually a real thing, but there was still a lot of people like, I don't know, you know, and then we're in a position now where there's like way more people that are doing it. But there's still large enterprises where they're still kind of getting their head around it. And so what we'll see is a group, this is a typical thing with adoption of ideas, right? You'll see a group that does this as a kind of experiment, as a trial balloon, and it goes really well, and then suddenly it goes from 1 to 5 to 15 different groups. Ben, in your situation, like there's nobody in the shop who's like going to say, oh, I don't really want to use feature flags. Definitely
not.
Right? The bigger the org, the more likely you might have islands where there's still some debates going on. But it's pretty typical. I mean, it's a good time to be in the space as a vendor because there's not so much debate about whether this is an okay idea anymore. It's now, how do I do this? And then what can I do with it? And how do I get my teams, if they are working a different way, to move in this direction? And it's one of those things that kind of, it's not quite exponential, but it's like, you know, somebody will come in and use this much of it. And then, you know, a year later, they're using 3 times as much. And a year later, they're using 12 times as much. And so, you know, that makes the investors pretty excited.
Sure. No, go ahead, Ben.
I wanted to go off on a tangent for a second. I don't know.
By all means.
So one thing that I think is really interesting, and this I think is not obvious at first or even until you've been using feature flags for a long time, which is that it changes the dynamic to some degree between the engineers and the product managers and the designers. Because in the pre-feature flag era, designers come up with the design. They have, you know, a very high fidelity vision of what they want something to look like. And I think they view themselves as sort of the stewards of the good experience. And as engineers are building it, and maybe it's being pushed up to its staging environment, the designers are sort of the gatekeepers, at least in my experience, on when something is okay to go to production, right? Like, oh, that text isn't the right size, or the colors aren't right. Here are the alignments funny, or it's not 100% feature complete. And you know, heaven forbid a user would see something that's not 100% feature complete yet. And you had no choice because nothing could go to production until it was done. But with feature flags and this incremental building of a feature and the incremental deployment of a feature, it changes the narrative. Because if you can get just, you know, arbitrary numbers here, if you can get something into production and it's 80% complete and users haven't seen it yet, but it would add a tremendous amount of value to the user experience, engineers and engineering managers and product managers can now start to have a different conversation, because it's no longer about we have to get to 100% completeness, otherwise the world will end. It's now, hey, there's value in production today that we could be delivering to our users, and we're choosing not to because, you know, 5% of the edge case UI hasn't been built yet. And now it's is it worth not giving customers value to make sure that 5% is complete? So it's almost like the designer, who I think, you know, they're very UI, very experience oriented. They're no longer the stewards of the good experience. They are the ones who are saying, hey, let's not give the customers value that we could be giving them today. And they have to now have a very different explanation of why they think that's important. And I know that sounds like a very adversarial thing, but the reality is, within a company and the layers of an organization, there's always a tension. and a healthy tension, right? Because we all sort of focus on different things and we all have different priorities. But when you can get stuff to production sooner, it shifts the leverage that different people have within an organization on how we start to deliver customer value. I don't know if that made any sense.
It certainly does, within you're at least missing out on the opportunity for that last minute feedback from a group of beta testers that isn't potentially blocked by we're not on the full company styling and design that we really want to provide. When we start rolling out a release, we can say, okay, you guys are our trusted ambassadors or whatever. Please let us know what you think. It's in progress. We want your feedback because this may be a month down the line, but we have something functional. It's not going to work perfectly, but that's more important than waiting that extra month to get to something that's fully slick.
Yeah. And if you have a design partner customer, you got a customer who's pushing for some feature and is also willing to help you vet that feature.
Yeah.
Right? You can basically take stuff live for them many times before you ever get it to the rest of the population, right? And get that feedback. And then also, even when we have something we think is done, we'll often push it to some percentage and let it sit for a few days and watch to see what happens. Like, are we going to get any issues? Are people complaining? Is there system issues or whatever, right? And so it just takes that, instead of things having to be perfect and we're super duper sure, like, we have a reasonable belief that we're there. Let's show it to 5% or 20% or whatever, depending on your business. Google can show something to a fraction of a percent and it's hundreds of thousands of people. Most of us don't live in that world, right? So you might want to give it to a few more, right? But like it gets you in a situation where there's more flow, frankly, where there's just more likely and flow is good. Like flow humans would prefer flow over being stuck in a log jam. And there's just a lot of things that come with achieving flow. And even if you occasionally make a mistake or something, the upside of flow is so much bigger than a 15-minute outage or a 5-minute outage or a day of people saying, yeah, that's kind of funky, right? Because you're just getting several orders of magnitude more stuff done. It's not a percentage change. It's literally, when you can push 100 times more releases in a month or a year than you would otherwise do, there's just way more opportunity for progress.
For progress and also for unexpected things. If you can deploy something and you get into this cadence where it doesn't have to be 100% complete and you can start to show it to customers, then what happens when there's an emergency totally unrelated to your task? If you had never released this code, if this was code sitting somewhere in a feature branch in a staging environment, and now there's an emergency somewhere and a team has to get pulled off of their work, that effort that you put into building that thing that's not 100% complete is basically just tech debt at this point. It's code sitting there rotting, not doing anything. But if you can get to a point earlier where you can start to add customer value, even if it's not, again, 100% complete, and then there's an emergency and a team has to be pulled off, well, great. There's customers using it, getting value out of it. You can go do other things. And now you can come back when you have the availability to finish out the polish and the edge cases that maybe would have been a blocker in a previous life.
Yeah, 100%. It's like a ratcheting. You sort of progress.
Yeah,
I can stop here, I can stop, but it's not the same thing. So ironically, people worry about, if it's so easy to turn off, don't end up with a lot of stuff on the shelf.
Yeah,
it's one of those paradoxes, which you're likely to have less shelfware if the process of going from commit to prod is much shorter than if you spend weeks or months working on stuff. Like, it's not a lot of fun to work on something for weeks or months and then have it never see the light of day because something changed.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Or have something fall behind on a stale branch.
Yeah, or that we changed priority, had new priority.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a new customer that's been signed. You committed to doing something. You've got to drop what you're doing, and the minute you drop it, it starts like it starts to rot. Because other things are changing. Right. And so getting back to that code gets harder and harder with every passing day. And so, it's
also, and not to harp on this idea of deploying things that are not 100% feature complete, but I think there's so much power in that. And we talked about experimentation earlier and this idea that you can start to understand what people actually want, and continuing to riff on the idea of task management. You could imagine that task management is a list of tasks. And as you're adding new tasks, they're getting added at the top or they're getting added at the bottom, whatever. And the designer says, hey, wouldn't it be great if you could drag and drop tasks, you could resort your tasks within a list. If you're going to deploy something only when it's 100% feature complete, then the assumption is that 100% of the features are needed by 100% of the users that are going to access that thing. But you don't have any evidence of that. But if you can, just for sake of discussion, let's say that there is no ability to resort tasks, and you deploy that and it's behind a feature flag, and you get it to the point where you're like, all right, it's good enough. Let's turn it on for customers. And people start using it. They're creating tasks. And then the support team starts to get tickets about, hey, I can't reorder my task. That would be really helpful. Well, did you get 1,000 tickets or did you get 7? And if you got 7, well, now it's a whole prioritization conversation. Yeah, 7 people aren't happy that they can't reorganize the things that they couldn't even do, a week ago. Is that worth prioritizing? Is there other stuff that would be a higher return on investment? And now you can start to get real insight into what the features should actually contain, because you're getting actual user feedback instead of just assuming that you have an understanding of what people want.
I certainly like that level of experimentation, like the discovery of what the feature should actually be, and it giving you the path to do that by giving them something functional that's not blocked by much of anything. We're past the hour. This has been great. Thank you, Dave and Ben. I don't know if there's anything that you want to sign off with of where people can find your stuff. I was curious of what are you working on now, and maybe Ben, what is something interesting you're thinking about using feature flags for at your company, or Dave, what it is that you guys see on the horizon you want to enable people to use?
I'll give a really quick. Basically, if somebody's kind of curious about some of these ideas, just Google Dave Caro Progressive Delivery, right? There's videos, there's a playlist, there's some blogs. But if you just want to kind of like get onboarded and or go a little deeper, just Google Dave Caro, K-A-R-W, Progressive Delivery, and you'll find a bunch of goodies there. Because again, my job is to kind of spread the ideas. I think that so I think it's awesome you guys give a platform for people to kind of learn these new ideas, because if it's new to you, it's good. And I'm stoked. Ben, I had no idea you're going to be here. And I'm so stoked that we have an actual like practitioner who's like seriously deeply into this. Because it's what do you want? You want to share? Like Ben's written some awesome blogs. So
yeah, if you Google for Ben Nadel feature flags, stuff will come up. I can't underscore enough how much we love feature flags at InVision. I'm using them constantly. I don't, other than small text changes and things that I'm 100% convinced won't explode, everything is behind a feature flag. And those feature flags get removed from the application once they get rolled out, so that they don't live forever. It's this sort of life cycle. You add the feature flag, you build the feature, you roll it out, then you remove the feature flag, because at some point it doesn't make sense to undeploy or unrelease code. But everything, I mean, there's nothing in particular. Sometimes my father used to say it's easier to show people no than it is to tell them no. And I go the other way. I feel like it's easier to show people yes than it is to tell them yes. So a lot of times I'll have an idea for something and I want to build it, and the product team will be like, no, that doesn't make any sense. So I say, okay, I'm going to build it anyway, but I'll put it behind a feature flag, and then we'll circle back in a couple of weeks and I'll show you what I built running in production. And now you have to tell me that it wasn't a good idea, which, a lot of times they say yes, and it's still not a good idea. But sometimes they say like, you know what? That is good. Let's do that. Let's go.
Yeah. And what would it take to take that live, Ben? Yeah. Well, it is live, and give me 30 seconds and I'll have it live for 100% or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. And you get that there's a visceral emotional feeling that people get when they're using something in production. And if you can experiment behind a feature flag and then show them their data with the new feature that has not been released to the public yet, it's sometimes hard for people to think about why that would be a bad idea.
Totally makes sense. Thank you both so much for joining me. Ben, Dave, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in for Deploy Friday. Next week, we'll be talking about headless e-commerce. We hope you tune in for that one as well. You guys, thanks again, and everybody take care.
Cheers.
Awesome. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Bye-bye.